Serious. What is something scary that has happened to you that you cannot explain rationally? Okay, this might be a little long, but here it goes. Around the time I was a sophomore in high school, my parents decided to tear down our house and rebuild, seeing as a lot of people in our neighborhood were doing the same for value purposes. I had made multiple jokes about how cool it would be to get a secret room that no one knew about, but I didn't actually expect them to take adding it into consideration. Turns out, they worked with the contractor and ended up having an area set aside. Basically, if you were looking inside my closet and turned right, you could walk to the corner where there was a 1.5 feet bar to hang clothes. If you moved those clothes, there was a wall behind that you could push open and bam, the hidden room, fully equipped with a ceiling light and electric plugs. Imagine how many games of hide and seek I won. No one ever found me. The room was my precious secret, and I wasn't going to share it with any person outside of my family. Unfortunately, after a few months passed by, I began to get tired of the room. First of all, trying to squeeze past all of the clothing proved to be a pain. Then I'd have to slide through the tiny space to get into the room, which wasn't all that big itself. The magic had worn off. So I stopped entering it. Fast forward to a couple months later when things began to get weird. Our family had left for vacation for 2 weeks, so we had one of our neighbors take care of the house. We had been having a lot of crime in the area, so she occasionally stopped by just to check. When I had gotten back home, I was exhausted and wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed. Opening the door to my room, which was dark, I noticed that something was off. I could see a faint glow coming from underneath my closet door. Okay. I thought to myself, my neighbor must have been going through my stuff. So I walked over to turn off the light, only to realize that the closet light switch was facing down. Confused, I opened the door, and to my horror I noticed that, in the corner, all of my clothes have been shoved aside, the wall to my secret room has been pushed open, and the light was on. How was this possible? No one knew of that room other than my parents and the contractor. I stood there in utter disbelief for about a minute until I realized my neighbor must have really explored the place. I warily made my way to turn off the light, followed by putting the wall door back in its place and moving the clothes back to their normal formation. I'm going to try and explain what happened next as best as I can. Still kind of freaked out, or at least confused, I start to exit my closet. I'm standing in its frame, looking across my room into the corner, where I have an iron floor mirror. I'm looking at my reflection when I notice that the closet space behind me suddenly lights up, and I hear this scraping noise. Or at least I think that's what it was. My heart had been pounding so hard that my ears could only hear the rush of blood with every beat. I just remember jerking my head back inside my closet to find that all of my clothes were moved aside, the wall was pushed open, and you guessed it, the light to the secret room was on. Once I was able to move from my petrified state, I convinced myself that I had been so confused when I had initially seen the secret room open that I had not really closed it back at all. But I know that I was lying to myself. Throughout the next few months, weird things kept happening. They weren't anything major, but still weird to the point where I couldn't explain it. For example, I would walk into my bathroom only to find that my toilet seat was being left up. Every single time. I was assuming my dad was coming into my room to use it, but that would mean he had a serious case of overactive bladder. When I approached him about it, he looked at me as though I were crazy and asked why he would use my bathroom when we had one down the hall. I couldn't answer that question. There were other instances when I would wake up in the morning only to find that, on multiple occasions, my closet door was wide open. Before any of you say that's not a big deal, let me clarify that I had been slightly terrified of my closet and made sure every night that its door was closed before I went to sleep. I would check to make sure I heard the click and pull back and forth a few times to prove it had been shut all of the way. There was no reason it should be wide open. And there was also no explanation for why, occasionally, the light was turned on in the middle of the night. I know. Malfunctioning lights and toilet seats don't come off as scary, but bear with me. I was freaked out to the point that I finally approached my mom about it when we were both working in our downstairs office one day. Background story on her. She doesn't believe in ghosts whatsoever. In fact, she raised me and my older brother, who had been moved out since we had lived in the new house, to think that any person who believed in ghosts was crazy. So when I tell her of my suspicions, I'm surprised when she sighs and says she's noticed weird things have happened too. She continued to tell me how when we first moved into our house, the one we tore down, She would always hear footsteps walking around in my brother's room. This would confuse her because he was at school every time this happened, but she could have sworn she'd hear him running around. One time when she had walked up, toys were sprawled across his carpet. This took her by surprise because he hadn't left his room like that before heading out. She then goes on to explain that the previous owners of the house had a young son that died in my brother's room, which is what led them to selling the house. Which she never told me about before. I'm guessing she thought I was old enough to know now and not form any irrational stories about ghosts haunting our house. If that had been her goal, I hate to inform her that it absolutely did not work. At this point, I am now positive that our house is haunted. She wrapped up her story and laughed it off as though it's silly to believe that there wasn't a logical explanation to weird things happening. The footsteps coming from the old house was because it was old. The lighting and toilet issues were stemming from the fact that the house was brand new. Yeah. Okay. At that point, we swivel around in our office chairs and continue working on our computers. After a minute or so, I can hear this loud, almost white noise sound. I turn to my mom, thinking she was taking a break and watching some weird video, when I notice she's looking at me with the same confused face. "It sounds like your shower is running," she said. My bedroom bathroom was directly above our heads. Our dazed expressions stemmed from the fact that my shower hadn't worked for a good month or so. New houses come with a lot of problems. Right as she said that, the water had stopped running and things went silent right before we heard 5 loud footsteps. I just remember seeing my mom turn white and immediately bolt upstairs, past my dad who was sitting on the couch watching TV. I finally joined her, only to find that she was looking in my closet, under my bed, everywhere. She had tried to explain to my dad what she had heard, but he insisted it was some piping issue. And she eventually believed him. There was no way that was piping. I just kind of stayed upstairs, accepting the fact that something weird, but probably harmless, was occupying my room. Oh, and as I was thinking about everything that has happened, I realized that my current room is exactly where my brother's old room used to be. I know that's not how hauntings work exactly, but it makes for a better story explanation, yes? A friend of mine's house burned to the ground when I was younger, and his family moved across the street in a house that they rented for a bit. The basement in said rented house was unfinished, so being middle schoolers, we decided we would use the basement to ride skateboards and scooters. So after one night of skateboarding, we head upstairs to watch scary movies and pass out. Neither of his parents nor his sister were home, went to his grandparents for the night if I remember correctly. As we were getting close to sleep, we hear as something hit the ground really hard on the concrete of the basement, so being dumb teenagers we decide to investigate. As we open the door to the basement and peer down, we just see a skateboard floating mid-air. We sit and watch for a few seconds, and then it drops suddenly and very violently. Needless to say, we packed our stuff up and sprinted back my house. Not much sleeping happened that night. His family moved out soon after, and we tend to avoid that house as much as possible. This is ongoing and only happens when I'm home alone. About 5 months ago, I got home from work at about 10 p.m., and to enter the living room, you have to walk past the basement stairs. I did so without actually looking straight down them, but had full vision of them. There was a huge brown head at the bottom of the stairs, opening and closing its mouth. I took about 5 steps past the stairs before it caught up with me, and then I was scared that it was a person in my basement. I called a friend of mine to come over, she did, and we didn't find anything down there. All the doors were locked, nothing had been moved. A few months after that, I was watching TV upstairs before work. I heard a noise like something had been thrown across the room in the basement. I froze for a sec, looked around, and saw that all my pets were in the same room as me. I called my friend again, told her to stay on the line as I checked out the basement. All the doors were locked, nothing was moved. I've heard that noise, it sounds like someone is throwing something large and heavy at the wall, about 5 more times, and still haven't figured out what it is. Haven't seen the face again, but I always feel someone watching me when I'm in the kitchen, which is at the top of the stairs. I was working at a hotel in Albuquerque, the graveyard shift. I had been talking to the security guard, and he asked if he could get a ride home, so instead of waiting for 30 minutes for my shift to end, I just left a note for my boss that said I left early because my brother was stranded outside of town and needed me to get him. Total lie on my part, but I needed a good excuse to leave early. I drop off the security guard at his place, then go home and go to sleep. A couple of hours of sleep and I wake up to my phone ringing. It was my brother. He tells me he is stranded outside of town and he needs me to go get him. I tell my brother the lie I told my boss and how much of a coincidence his calling me is. He says that's not weird, he will show me what's weird when I get there. I get there and ask him what is weird. He puts his phone up to my ear and plays a message that he got when he woke up that morning. It's a voice that kind of sounded computerized but mostly just creepy sounding. It says, "You're stuck." Freaked us both out. Never figured out where the call came from. Strangest, creepiest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. I posted this a long time ago, but when I was younger, my mom was dating this guy, who we will call JB, and after a few months he invited my mom, me, and my brother to go with him and his son, about my age, out to his lake house for the weekend. It was right on Lake Michigan, but up in a more secluded area which was pretty awesome. Well, we got up there and for one, I already felt really creeped out. It was a smaller 2, maybe 3 if you count the really big attic story house that had the living room, dining room, kitchen on the first floor and had 2 bedrooms on the second floor. His grandfather had helped build the place with the grandfather's dad, and then he lived there for most of his life, working as a tailor in the nearby town. We went up to the attic to get some beach toys because that's where JB kept all of that stuff, so he didn't have to haul it every time he went out there. Well, when we went up to the attic, I noticed in the corner covered in some dust and cobwebs about 8 mannequins, some just upper torsos and some full body. Not too out of the ordinary considering a tailor had lived there. Me and JB's son slept down in the living room on the couch since there were no more beds, and near midnight-ish, I heard one of the stairs squeak a few times. Figuring it was my mom coming to check to make sure we were asleep, I told his son to be quiet and quickly turned the TV off and hid under the covers. After not hearing any noise for a few minutes, I looked out from under the covers and saw 3 of the mannequins moving around in the kitchen. Like their body parts weren't moving, but they were sliding around the kitchen. I swore I was dreaming but was so terribly frightened I hid back under the covers with a small yelp and then heard the dragging on the floor coming closer and peeked out seeing one of them just a few feet from the couch. I hid back under the covers and shut my eyes tight hoping it would go away. The next morning I got up and tried not to think about it, really hoping it was just a bad dream, but when we went back up to the attic to put the beach stuff back, the mannequins were in different spots and weren't covered in cobwebs anymore. Don't believe me if you don't want to, but it happened and I've been scared fleebless of mannequins ever since.